I'd like to tell you a story about my family today. It's one that's shared by Japanese Americans who settled on the West Coast from Washington to California. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt called that day a day of infamy. And for the 120,000 Japanese Americans and their immigrant parents, that day served as a catalyst. It would shake the foundation of their belief in America and challenge the core values they held as American citizens. My mother's family had immigrated to California around the turn of the century from Japan. They had settled in Berkeley, California, and there my great-grandparents raised 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters. The eldest was my grandmother, Matsuko Hayashida. She married my grandfather, Sumio Kawasaki, about 2 years before the war started. Now, Grandpa had been born here in California, but he had been raised in Japan, and he returned when he was about high school age. He worked his way through high school and college by serving as a houseboy and working in the fields. It was while he was a student at UC Berkeley majoring in economics that he met my grandmother. He rented a room in the home of my great-grandparents, and of course, the rest is history. Now, my grandfather afterwards, after he finished school, he graduated and he looked for a job. Now, back then, my grandmother says it was really basically impossible for a Japanese American with a college degree to find a professional position with a U.S. company. So my grandfather was very fortunate when he received an offer to work for the Mitsubishi Trade Company in San Francisco. Now, because it had been a long time since he had gone back to Japan and visited his mother, he decided to take a quick trip back. And it was while he was there that Mitsubishi actually offered him a position there with the oil company. Now, since those who were hired by, say, the Home Office held a higher status than anyone hired by a local office, my grandfather decided to stay and accept that job, and it was decided that my grandmother would come then to Japan to meet him there and marry him. Well, it was April 1939 that my grandmother made the trip. It took a great deal of courage for her. She had been born and raised in California, and to her, Japan was a faraway and foreign land. But make the trip she did, and it was while she was on the boat to Japan that she met another Japanese woman there, about 40, who had recently given birth to a baby boy, her 3rd child. This woman had come from Japan to the United States some years earlier in order to marry a friend of her brother's. Now, this friend had opened a small hardware shop in Sacramento, California, and like many Japanese immigrant men who came and settled in the United States, they had to send to Japan for wives because of the laws against interracial marriage at that time, and so that was how she ended up coming to California. Well, they were on their way back to Japan for an extended stay, and my grandmother remembers being able to hold the baby. And of course, once they docked in Japan, the two women went their separate ways. Years later, they would meet again when that baby boy married my mother. Now, my grandparents settled in Japan for about a year, and then my grandmother says she started to not feel very well. So she decided to go to see the local doctor, which proved to her to be a totally unenlightening experience. She says that back then, those Japanese doctors, she says, they didn't tell you very much. They really never told you what was going on. And so this doctor said to her, well, you're probably just homesick, and maybe what you need is a change in scenery. Well, my grandmother decided that she would return to the United States for a visit and see her family and friends. She said no sooner had she stepped off the ship and her mother met her, that her mother took one look at her and quickly diagnosed the source of the problem. You're pregnant, she told her. Hence the birth of my mother, Chieko Kawasaki, in October of 1940. Well, my grandfather in the meantime made plans to return to the United States to join his wife and his new baby daughter. But before he could do so, the war broke out, and my grandfather found himself stranded in Japan. Meanwhile, the community's reaction to the bombing of Pearl Harbor was one of shock. They kept thinking, how could Japan bomb the United States? How could Japan do such a thing? Well, for them, they had hoped, and they had every reason to hope, that the United States and Japan would remain at peace with one another, and they had every reason to want to hope. They had adopted the United States as their homeland, purchased their homes here, had their children here, and made their livelihoods here. And more importantly, their children had been born here, raised here, educated here, and knew no other culture than what it was to be American, for they were American. Well, with my grandfather in Japan, the United States now began looking at the Japanese Americans as if they were dealing with an enemy that existed within their own borders. And so a great deal of fear and espionage. And there were questions about, yes, the Japanese are spying on us. And yet, ironically, there were no cases of espionage that ever came to pass. What the United States was about to do was to deal with Americans, and yet they seemed to not realize that these were Americans rather than enemy aliens within their border. Indeed, those that were not American citizens by birth were forbidden from becoming naturalized. Some of the Japanese immigrant men had fought for the United States during World War I. And it was because of this they had been promised that they would receive U.S. citizenship. However, with the passage of the Oriental Exclusion Act, that promise never came to be. Well, on February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which forced the evacuation and internment of all persons of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. And so it was because of that that within several weeks of the order, Japanese Americans had to dispose of their homes, their jobs, and their businesses. And by March 29th of 1942, my family found itself at the Tanforan Assembly Center, a temporary evacuation site until the United States moved them to permanent facilities. Ironically, the very attitudes that now forced the Japanese Americans into internment were the same attitudes that in Japan allowed my grandfather to continue to live and work. In fact, both the United States and Japan considered the Japanese Americans to be Japanese rather than American. Well, I don't want to leave my family here at the Assembly Center, so I'm going to take a break. And if you'd like to join me in a couple of moments, I'll start again and tell you the rest of the story. Thank you.